Hey, strong people, Beck here. Another episode of the Strong Talk podcast. Thanks for listening and tuning in. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving week. Took a week off. It's a down week for podcasts, and I was busy with family. I hope you all understand. Going to be putting these podcasts out weekly. Already got a couple recorded. Myself and Michael Battolino just kind of talked about all the strongman news that's currently going on and a little catch up. That'll be up next week, and the following week we will have Nick Shaw of Renaissance Periodization on to talk about diet, bulking, training, how to drop a weight class, a bunch of stuff like that, and talking about his business, Renaissance Periodization, also known as RP Strength. Go to rpstrength.com. And this episode, again, is brought to you by rpstrength.com. They have their brand new diet templates. And when we say diet templates, they work for bulking too. It's going to make sure that you get, evidence-based approach to eating for performance. One thing that is always going to hold your training back is if you don't have, a handle on your nutrition, whether you're trying to maintain diet to lose body fat or bulk to gain weight. There's a better way to do it, and you can go to rpstrength.com to get started. Highly recommend the diet templates, Renaissance Diet ebook, and all their other products. This episode is also brought to you by Starting Strongman. Go to store.startingstrongman.com for all of your strongman training needs, from knee sleeves and wrist wraps and straps to, we got new spandex booty shorts, the Strong Woman, double S Strong Woman. The little, it's a little trying to rebrand our apparel and logo. Instead of the whole Starting Strongman thing, just put a little double S at the front. Hope you like it. They're already selling well. Appreciate everyone who did their Black Friday, Cyber Monday, everything shopping on our store. Check out the new booty shorts, or spandex shorts, however you want to call them. And going to be putting out some more apparel like that soon. Got a couple other things. Sold out of grip shirts. Looking to get some more in. Of course, you can sign up for our Starting Strongman training templates if you just want proven workouts and programming delivered right to your phone for $15 a month. But you can get 30% off if you use the code STRONGTALK. Get that at store.startingstrongman.com. Code STRONGTALK makes it $10.55 a month. That's $10 or $10.50 a month. This episode is also brought to you by Kabuki Strength. Go to kabukistrength.com. They just came out with their new line of barbells. If you want some high-end barbells, check that out. They got the shoulder rock. I actually just ordered mine. Took advantage of the Cyber Monday deals. Those are done, but if you use the code SS10, I believe, you can get 10% off everything at kabukistrength.com. Go to Strength Shop USA for all of your strongman needs, from equipment like yokes, etc. Go to strengthshopusa.com. We're also brought to you by SBD USA, the best knee sleeves and wraps and training equipment there is, in my opinion. You can get that at store.startingstrongman.com, or you can go straight to sbdusa.com. That. This week's episode is about the documentary The Mighty Atom, talking about the story of the old-time strongman Joseph Greenstein. Joseph Greenstein was 5'4", circus performer strongman. It's a really fascinating story. We get into it. He did all kinds of different. It's really cool, in my opinion, to look back at some of the stuff that came to, modern strongman, where it's more of a sport. And we talk about that. And this documentary is put together by his grandson, Steve Greenstein. And we have a good conversation, just talking about some, other stuff, just how it was growing up in a family of strongman before, it was as big as it is now. And, some of the cultural significance of Joseph Greenstein as well. Again, it's called The Mighty Atom. you can get more information at themightyatomdoc.com, DOC. You can rent or buy it anywhere where you can get video on demand, like Amazon, on iTunes, Vimeo on demand, and check the show notes and at startingstrongman.com. Just search The Mighty Atom on there, and we'll have links to buy or rent the film as well. If you like it, it's definitely worth the watch. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy this conversation about The Mighty Atom. Welcome to another episode of the Strong Talk podcast. I am Kalle Beck, and I'm joined by the documentary, by the director of the documentary, The Mighty Atom, grandson to the Mighty Atom himself, Steve Greenstein. How are you doing, Steve?
Very nice to meet you. I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, and so I got an email a couple weeks ago with a link to watch the documentary you made about your grandfather, Joseph Greenstein, and and I really enjoyed it. It's fun. This is a little bit of a different interview for the listeners because we're going way back to the old time strongman, kind of the roots of how strength feats happened, and before World's Strongest Man started as like kind of a sport. In the 70s, we're going back all the way to the early 1900s here, where it was more feats of strength, and it was like kind of like a circus performance, and like I don't even think things like the barbell were really invented yet, or even if they were, there was like maybe a couple places in the country that even had weight training. It wasn't really a thing. So to be obsessed with being strong back then, you really had to be dedicated. Like, people think it's hard to find access to strongman equipment now. Try doing it, and I'm not sure exactly when Joseph, the Mighty Atom's, his whole career started in it, but
Sure.
you pretty much had to find some horseshoes and bend them and see how it went.
Yeah, he started at a time where there were no gyms. They just weren't available, on the corner the way they are today. And so when he was younger and started to become strong, in order to train, he would fill up cans with cement and take a steel pipe and put it through and fashion his own weights. So training back then, there were definitely some types of lifts people would do. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, Joe Greenstein, he set a world record in a back lift when he was a young man, where on some type of a board they would put weights, and he had to go from a squatting position and stand up. So there definitely were some type of records and lifts that were more traditional back then, but in general, it really was something, if you wanted to pursue it, you had to really work hard and be sort of inventive.
Yeah, I still feel like that's the case even today to some extent. It's not really in your face. The participation in modern strongman's really on the rise, just as there's been more inclusion in different weight classes. And of course, your grandfather was not the prototypical build of a strongman. So it's really risen lately, and there's been more access to equipment even just in the last 5 years. But I remember even when I started, like my first training day, like I found this 6'6" Viking named Evan Hansman, and I met him in a redwood forest in the mountains of Santa Cruz, and they just had a bunch of homemade stuff. So it's still very rudimentary, even like hundreds of years later. But
yeah.
I think it would be interesting to see some of the stuff that from then it seemed like things get put into the sport now that seem new and to a lot of people, but it's really important to know your history of the sport and to look back at people like your grandfather and some of the stuff they did, because everything comes around, because like certain things like were introduced in the 2000s, like the axle clean and press, which is just a staple now, but Poland's axle, they made that, and Rogue Fitness just put out a great documentary on how that all came about, and that was around the same time. Or even the backlift, that was performed at a lift at an event a couple of years ago by professional strongmen today. But it's not a very.
Sure.
But maybe that might be the thing that everyone sees in contests next year, and everyone's like, I've never seen this, but they've been around for over 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, the most unique thing about my grandfather was that he was 5'4". So the name, Mighty Atom, ATOM, was because he was such a small person able to do these incredible things. And the thing that is very uncommon, and people still do it today, but my grandfather pretty much invented it, was bending steel. That was a thing, a method of training and a act of strongmanism that is very unusual. So you take cold rolled steel, whether it be a very long bar and you scroll it, or a very short bar and you turn it into whatever shape, a horseshoe. And a lot of what he did focused on acts of strength involving steel or biting through things. He did a lot with his hair and his teeth. So in that regard, it wasn't conventional, but it certainly was, I would say, not common, but it was something that was more readily available back then, and then very few people do it today.
Yeah, and I think, even if we're going from, traditional modern day strongman where it's kind of, ran more like a sport versus a show, I think the point for me, what drew me to it has always been to showcase feats of strength in a way that people can understand they're difficult, right? So even today,
Sure.
you take, the average person walking by, at some festival or something, and they see someone deadlifting 900 pounds or 600 pounds, they're not really going to be able to tell the difference. But if they see someone picking up the back of a car, they can. Everyone's like, if you see someone, bend a nail with their hand, everyone's driven a nail, into a board at some point probably. And they understand how hard those things are and stuff. So just making the feats of strength applicable to, everyday life has always been something. And I think some of the sport today needs more of, but I think it's, I want to go back. I really enjoyed the documentary, being a small Jewish strongman myself, being 5'7", competing at 175 pounds.
Yeah.
My grandparents were actually from Poland as well, and they fled. So I found that, an interesting aspect in some of the hardships he faced, back then, even, having to flee from the country, he was born in to, I believe, in Texas, and then just trying to show that like a Jewish person could be physically strong was met with resistance.
Yeah, I mean, so much of his life was met with resistance. First of all, he was supposed to die. He wasn't even supposed to be alive past 18, 19 years old. So there weren't really adequate medical facilities, and Slovakia, Poland is where he's from. He had to get past that. I think 8 in 10 people died of tuberculosis, and he was able to outlive it by training his mind and training his body and having a health regimen that really wasn't even created until he did it. And he had to sort of figure out on his own what could make him survive. And then he finally overcomes that, and now there's pogroms, and he has to leave Poland, leave where he's, living, leave his parents, and come to the United States. And there were, I think I found out from making the film, I never understood how he got here, but there was a wealthy Polish businessman, another Jew, who sent for about 40,000 Polish immigrants to come to Galveston, Texas specifically. And that's where he landed, and he was able to sort of start his career as a strongman in Galveston.
Yeah, I found that, really interesting piece. Just shows even, at some of the heights of our history, of our lack of humanity, there's, shining lights of, someone who's going to try to, probably save 40,000 people. I'm, as, some being of Jewish descent myself, and I'm sure that you have, family members who were lost around those times, as do I. And, it's just a horrible part of, history, but, that someone's going to go through that. And then, it goes on to move to Texas and then perform all these feats of strength. It's just, shows how good people can be at the same time as how awful, humans can be.
His whole story for me is about overcoming. I mean, it's a story about strength on the outside, but it's really a story about the human spirit. and what we're all capable of. I mean, we talk about it in the movie. There's no reason on earth why a sick 5'4", 148-pound guy should be able to do anything that he's doing and invent these things and create marvelous feats of strength that are, you try to do it today, it's damn near impossible. But he was able to unlock his mind, and that's really the trick to it. Of course, there's a functional part of the body that has to be trained, and he did that as well. But the lesson for every athlete is that this is possible if you decide in your mind 100% that you want something, you can do it. And that's the mission of this film, and that was really his mission in life.
Yeah, and back then the best way to get that to show people that was to get their attention by doing these feats of strength and kind of traveling around, because there was no internet. You couldn't just post a video on YouTube or make a documentary like you did. So
yeah, he had a truck. He would travel around. All of my uncles and my father were also performers, so it was a family show, and it was the Greenstein boys would travel around performing feats of strength. And what made my grandfather so healthy internally from being such a sick child, he developed these products and decided to sell them, and that was how he made his living. So the basic gist was all the boys would go and perform, and then afterwards you could buy some of the products that he would say would help keep his body in great shape to perform these types of things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how similar the industries still are. It's like, I put out training videos, YouTube videos, articles, and at the end it's like, hey, here's these lifting straps, here's this. That's kind of, the way you can actually, keep putting that kind of information or show out there to make it sustainable.
Sure.
Not much changes.
No, it doesn't. But in the same way that Roger Bannister, when he first broke the 4-minute mile, then everyone else realized they could do it. And I think within a year, 15 more people had done it. It's the same thing with my grandfather and these feats of strength. When you teach someone that this is possible and they see that it's possible, all of a sudden their mind says, well, wait, what can I do? How can I go past that? And it's very much part of the human condition to say, oh, once I unlock the key that it is possible, then the next person can do better and better after that. So, in passing these things down generationally, which he did, he had a protege named Slim the Hammerman who's in the film. Slim taught a modern strongman named Dennis Rogers. Dennis teaches people. There's another guy named Chris Ryder, terrific people who do this as well. In doing that, they're passing it on, and then people can evolve it into something new. And it's really cool. The overall sport is really called the iron game. So in Europe, there's a lot of grip competitions where they'll bend frying pans for speed and things like that. The genesis is really all my grandfather and that generation of people. There were a few before him, like Louis Cyr, some others, Sigmund Klein, who did things like that. But when it came to metal specifically, that was really my grandfather creating it. And, it's just been really fun over the years. I've been a part of an organization called the Association of Old-Time Barbell Strongmen, and to watch them evolve and figure out the next cool thing to do.
Yeah, and is there a way to get more information on that association? Do they have a website?
I believe it's the AOBS.com. I just went to their dinner. They have an annual dinner where they induct not just steelbenders, but also modern, Mr. Americas and powerlifters and people who do more of the training that you do. It's one big community, and whatever corner of it you happen to be in, it's still part of a strength community. And so it's just cool to watch the whole thing, wrap into itself and see, I may do this one particular lift, and that's my space, but you're still very connected to the person who bends a steel bar with his teeth. It's not that far away.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all physical, feats of strength, and they can be, and we all kind of, find our niche. I feel maybe like, Louis Cyr did a lot more of the traditional strength lifts because he was just a massive man, where, your grandfather had such a strong mind, and, he didn't have, you put him next to Louis Cyr, it looks like me next to some of my friends today, like.
What's funny is Louis Cyr is the one who gave him the name, the Mighty Atom. When my grandfather broke a world record in that backlift, Louis Cyr was there. He was a few years older than my grandfather, maybe 15, 20 years older. And he saw him and said, you're tiny. You're like a little atomic particle. You're the Mighty Atom. And he gave him that name. And one of the devices we use in the movie was a radio interview that I found from 1967. And in that interview, he talks about how Louis Cyr gave him the name. I didn't use that in the film, but it was fascinating. I never knew that's how he came to have that nickname.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You got to put that up on the website as a little preview or some specials because I'd love to listen to some stuff like that. Um,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I want to get into now. Is you have this. So let's talk about like when you were growing up. When did you find out that obviously your father and uncles did this to some extent too, but you have this legendary grandfather. What was like? Did it just seem normal? Like that's just, oh yeah, that's
It
grandfather.
very, very much it felt normal because that's the world that I grew up in. So all my uncles were still performing. My father didn't perform much after he sort of left the traveling show. My father went into comedy and then got into some other things. A lot of my family ended up in some type of performance, but I would see my uncles do these things, and it was, when you're a kid and that's what you see, that's what's normal to you.
Sure.
Only when I would go to high school or in junior high school did I realize that there was something special going on. And then occasionally, in my grandfather's day, he was famous. He became less famous after he passed, but I would meet someone and, our faces, and you'll see it in the movie, our faces are exactly the same. You can't miss us. We are just generationally kind of creepily the same face. So someone would see me and say, "You remind me of this person." And, "Oh, I'm his grandson." And they would go on and on. And the people that saw him live, it's magic. It's still magic. I went to the AOBS dinner about a month ago. I had people coming up to me asking me for my autograph because what my grandfather did was magic to them. And, it's just a really interesting thing to be a part of. But for me, it was absolutely normal growing up.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, when did the idea come to make a documentary to, kind of highlight and bring back into, culture all these feats that your grandfather did and kind of show who he was and, the place that he made in,
Yeah.
strength sports.
I've wanted to do it for quite some time. My regular line of work is I direct commercials and TV shows. So I got into the business, and then films take money, and unfortunately, most of this had to come out of my own pocket. So it was really a matter of trying to have enough assets to make it work, and then eventually I was able to do it. But I've wanted to do it for years and years, and the message of the film is not really about lifting weights or bending steel or, my favorite thing he did, which was bite a nail in half. He could do that all the time. The message of the film is something I think we need specifically right now, which is just what are you capable of if you decide wholeheartedly in your mind you're going to do something, and you decide wholeheartedly in your heart that you're going to do something. And we have big problems. There's a lot of things going on in the world that we need to fix and we cannot have a defeatist attitude about them. And he was all about saying, well, doctors are telling me this, I say no. Conventional strength is telling me this, I say no. And he just kept doing things until it worked. And, certainly everything he ever tried didn't work, but, I wasn't going to bet against him. He's a lesson for everybody across. I don't care if it's science. I don't care if it's your job or your relationships. Whatever you decide in your heart that you really are going to do, you can do it.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I took away from it, and I think the same reason I fell in love with the traditional sport of strongman is or not traditional, but modern, how it is today is being a somewhat unathletic, you know, smaller sized, Jewish kid. I always wanted to play. We got the World Series going on, and I loved baseball and always wanted to do it, but couldn't hit a ball to save my life. Couldn't do any of this stuff, and then, the empowerment that lifting weights gives you. You're like, wow, I was able to do more than last week, and I didn't think I'd do that. And then you start to get that self belief, that self confidence by
Yeah.
getting progressively better, and then you go into more odd lifts, even if they're somewhat standardized in a way now. But you're picking up a giant round ball, that's just
Hmm.
pure, like just a rock, and you pick it up, and like maybe a month or 2 months ago I couldn't. I remember there was like a certain stone I couldn't pick up for over a year, and then finally I got it, and then I was able to do it easily. And then
Right.
getting that self-belief and building up your confidence. I was a very shy and insecure kid. I don't think a lot of people listening to this now would believe that, but I really was, and it gave me that kind of confidence and belief in myself that I could do other things, that I've taken into business, that I've taken into
Yep.
developing a good relationship with my wife, and everything, where it's just like I don't look at things like I did beforehand. And I think weights and strength gave me a lot of that, and you could see that you're really trying to resound that, like, you just go out and be your best is very
Yeah.
important note. And I love that when I'm going doing seminars, or I'm going to a contest, and or working with some clients, and you see them do that for the first time, and it clicks. And that's the thing I enjoy now, is you go, oh,
Yeah.
they didn't think they could do it, and then they did it.
Right. And then once you do it, and why do you take a sharp spike and then every time you pick up that stone, you can do it easily now? It's that understanding of what you're capable of. And it only comes from breaking through that barrier and really giving it your all. I mean, the lesson, how many times, whether it's, Elon Musk, or whether it's Michael Jordan, or whatever the lesson is, that you're just told you can't do something and then you do it. Michael Jordan didn't make his high school varsity basketball team. This stuff happens over and over, and yet somehow we're still convinced we have to listen to the voice of authority saying that is impossible. And it's hogwash. There's no reason why in any discipline that you can't go for something and believe in your heart that you could do it. So, in the movie, we have these vignettes where we talk about different people in modern day who sort of apply some of the lessons. And we've all heard this story in the news, but then we interview somebody who picked up a car off her father. The car had dropped, and in a moment of panic, she's like, "What?" And she's picked it up. And in that moment, there were no barriers. There was nothing on her mind other than, I must get my father out from under this car. And she picked up a car, dragged him out, and gave him CPR. Just think about the impact of that. 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later, she could never do it. But in that moment, when she removed the barrier in her mind, she did it. And that's, whether it's weights or anything else, it's a magical thing to know that we all have inside of us.
Yeah, and it comes down to it at some point that just because you have the possibility to do it, it's probably going to be extremely hard. It doesn't mean that it's effortless. Like, I'm sure,
Sure.
Your grandfather had a lot of failures. You say you work in, producing, commercials and TV. So you get dealt with rejection all the time, but
Yeah.
all you can do is just keep moving forward, and you fail all the time, and you usually learn from that.
Absolutely.
Or certain things, they might take, they might take longer. Life's long at some point. He led a long life, and there. That's what I like. I have my personal struggles. Every now, like, we all have bills. Or my health insurance went up a good chunk this year, so I'm like, oh, this makes life fun. Like all those basic things. But I always explain it to my wife. I go, okay, we have two things. You look at the current situation. How can we best handle this? Or you can just do nothing and just let it all kind of crumble. Like, that's basically
Right.
how it goes. So you just have to keep striving forward.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
put one foot in front of the other. So
Absolutely.
when you finally get some amount of funding and everything to make this film, and you start going through old footage, family photos and videos and everything. What was that like, just going back through? Because I'm sure being an adult, not a kid, and it's just your norm. You went out. Did it give it a whole a grander scope of what your family did, and what were some of you mentioned a couple, but what were some of the surprises you learned about your own family doing that?
Well, that's interesting because, obviously I'd grown up with this, but most of the film was on old 8mm reel to reel, string outs. And so we didn't have an ability to see that very often. And so in getting it transferred, I was really able to see him live do what was only myth before for me. So I obviously had seen pictures of things. I had heard stories of things, but when you watch someone take a horseshoe, then bend it in their teeth, One of the things that we have in the movie as well is a conventional bodybuilder who, on camera, he benches 585 3 times. He did another one too. We just didn't keep it in the cut. So he had 585 4 times. That to me is the strongest person that I know. And he tried to bend a horseshoe with his hands, and he couldn't do it on camera. My grandfather did that with his teeth on film. So just watching that, you just get your mind around, wow, like what this means. And, in making the film, we have a lot of these pieces around. I have the horseshoes that he used to bend, and they are heavy. And you think to yourself, how on earth? So that was one part that was fascinating. But one thing I discovered through the film that I didn't know about how he became famous, to me, is like my favorite part of making the film. When he came to Galveston, Texas, he had a gas station. That was his first job. He was an oil worker, an oil rig, and he would wrestle on the side. And it got to the point where no one could beat him, so he stopped getting matches. And so he ended up opening a gas station. And Houdini was traveling through town with his crew, and they got a flat tire. And back then, my grandfather was performing just for friends and showing off. I mean, certainly to do these things, you have to have some level of ego about it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you have to believe you can do it. So he would show off for friends, but he wasn't performing at all. And Houdini's crew has a flat tire. The nearest gas station happened to be my grandfather's. And he could pick up a car with his hands and change a tire with his hands with no tools. That was the part of the shtick. I mean, a lot of what old-time strongmen do are feats of strength, but they try to put a spin on it that make it interesting or unusual. So you talk about it. One guy bends a penny, one, puts a license plate in the phone book and tears it in half and things like that. So he grabs a tire. He walks back to the car. He has no idea who Houdini is. It was 18 or something like that. Picks the car up with Houdini and 4 of his people in the car, takes the lug nuts off, changes the tire. And Houdini's manager is sitting next to him, looking out the window saying, what is going on? How is this happening? So he changes the tire, and then the manager, his name was Petrov, he came out and he said, what are you? Who are you? And he made a connection. They went back to his garage, and that's where he kept all of his training stuff. And he showed him a few things that he does, and that's how he became famous. The manager said, I want to sign you up to my roster of talent. I want to move you from Texas to New York. And that's how my whole family came to live in Brooklyn. My father, of the 10 children, is the only one who was born in New York. He was born in Brooklyn because of that move. And I didn't know that story before I made the film. So just things like that. I mean, what are the odds that would happen? I mean, so many things have to line up the right way to make that story come true at the right moment. And there it was. So, on the one hand, it's perseverance. On the other hand, some of it was just sort of written in the stars.
Yeah, and I that's a awesome story, and I get it a lot because there's people that are becoming pro strongman. We interview people right after they get their pro card, but you still have to kind of make a name for yourself, just rather than just competing. And I tell them all the time is like it's all opportunities and seizing the moment and carving out a niche. Like you'll see a lot of the more famous strongmen today. They have like a little thing they do, like they'll bench press a barbell with a bunch of girls on it, and that goes viral. Or they'll come up with some other thing, and just beyond the actual sport and the actual placings in World's Strongest Man or whatever. But the great ones that kind of separate themselves, they have that little thing where they're kind of always on, and you get a sense like. I'm sure if you're working in a small town in Texas and, it might have been a little bit fancier car and you could tell there's something to it, and he goes, I'm going to try to impress these people. Like, I'm sure he had that sense. They always do.
Yeah. I mean, he knew very much of what he did is about showmanship. And that was part of why, he used to lie about his age. He would always age himself and make himself 10 years older. So he passed away at 84, and he told people he was 94. Right. Because he wanted to basically have everyone be more impressed. Like somehow biting a nail in half was not impressive enough. He wanted to make sure, if they thought I was older, it would be more impressive. But there's showmanship in everything that these people do, and that was always a big part of his life. Whenever he would sell his products, which was always the main goal of any performance he was doing, as he was doing it, like at a state fair or something for money, he was always drawing people in with the feats of strength. Then he would talk about the product a little bit, and some people would kind of go away, and as they're about to walk away, he'd do something again and show them, hey, here's another cool thing to look at. And he was always about the performance and about keeping people interested.
Yeah, It's you gotta know, there has to be that balance. So he was known for doing feats of strength. Talk about making it different, which I haven't seen. Like I know a lot of people that they do this, and they also specialize in the grip stuff and bending nails and getting certified on that and rolling
Hmm.
frying pans and everything. But I haven't seen too many people do these things with their hair. So of course, being Jewish, I have that, big, thick hair. So I think that's a little bit of an advantage. Like, it gets crazy if I don't keep it under control.
Yeah.
So he definitely had that going for him.
Yeah,
So,
he did with the hair. He had to train his hair, so the
right.
hair wasn't naturally strong. I mean, there's certainly a point where your scalp's going to tear off your head. I mean, his most famous thing he did with his hair was he stopped a plane from taking off with his hair, which a two-passenger plane. But think about how much force that is. So they wrapped a rope around his body so he wouldn't be swept away, and the rest of it was a steel comb tied to his hair, and he stopped the plane from taking off. And you don't just get that. As a matter of fact, I tried so desperately to find articles and I couldn't, but I have it on good authority that another person tried that 2 years later and was killed instantly. His scalp was ripped off. And so my grandfather would hang weights from his hair, and my father tells me stories of how when he was a boy, his father, the mighty Adam, would pick him up by his hair and kind of bounce him to try to strengthen the scalp. So the scalp has to be almost calloused over time. You have to sort of get it thicker and more resistant, and then eventually you can do these things. So he had that good Jewy shock of hair, but
Sure.
why it became as strong as it did was really built over time.
Yeah, just like you have that genetic predisposition, but it has to be worked to be taken to its full advantage.
Yeah,
It's hilarious.
absolutely. Yeah, my uncle Mike, who was, I think, the one of my brother of the brothers, my uncles, who carried it on, up until really when he passed. He died at 95. At 93, he was on America's Got Talent about 3 years ago, and he pulled my father, my mother, and his girlfriend in a car with his teeth. And so, hair was one big thing for the Greenstein people, but teeth was another. And we are very lucky to have teeth that don't fall out. My wife's family, not as much, and the dental bills are always very high. But for us, we're able to, for some reason, keep it together. And so his teeth, he could do incredible things. I mean, to bite through metal or to bend it with your teeth, you just don't think that's something that your teeth can handle. But he was able to really do it just with resistance and training.
Yeah, I'm more on your wife's side, and she's more on yours.
Right.
But
That's funny.
we all get our things. Yeah, I can't get over your poor uncle that was getting bounced up and down by his hair. Little did he know
Yeah,
he didn't have any choice.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, I think he told me as young as when he was 2 or 3, they were doing that because the act was going on when he was a baby. So as part of the act, you had set changes. So in between, they would put the curtains up, and then someone would come out and tell some jokes or whatever. And my dad was running around as a 2 or 3-year-old, and they used to, as a joke, take like those old-fashioned radio flyers, and they would have him pull one of those. It wasn't very heavy with his hair, and they would do things just for fun to keep it interesting. So he knew that was just their life. There was no other choice, and there was no other. It seemed totally normal to them that's. I think my father even leads the film with it. To him, it was dad. He was a hardworking guy, and they called him Pop, and he just did his work. One of my favorite quotes from the movie is what we opened the movie with, which is my dad telling a very real story about how, one of his teachers asked everyone in the class to explain what their parents did for a living, and my dad said, my father bites chains and bends horseshoes, and they sent him home with a note saying that your son's making up things. So the next day, my grandfather came into school and he bit a chain in half right in front of the teacher and said, "Listen to my son. He knows what he's talking about." And, whose father does that? It's just absolutely crazy. He was offended that the teacher wouldn't believe this is something that's possible. And he came in and just spit out the link on the desk and then left. So, my grandfather was certainly eccentric, but was magical at the same time.
Yeah, he definitely comes off as very eccentric, which, like you said, to do, like I say it all the time, in the sport, like a lot of the athletes are very humble and they're helpful, but I've been around them, in all degrees, and there's a lot of ego involved, and it would be impossible for there not to be. I
Sure.
mean, like, how much more egotistical do you have to be than pursuing the title of I want to be the strongest man in the world? Like, just think about that, like, and
Absolutely.
thinking it's possible. You have to have, some belief, or, you have something to prove.
Yeah.
And so, but there is, also, and it builds characters just because of that, and they're attracted to it, whether they're successful or not. It's gonna bring all kinds, and
Yeah.
it's something I love about it, and I like doing these interviews as well, because you get to try to showcase just the cool people that have been involved in it, past and present.
Yeah.
But with that, it's probably a little hard. There's downsides.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, because it looked like, and I saw towards the end of the documentary, it seemed like you're kind of showing that he's like, I have to do more. I have to do more. You're never really satisfied. So what do you take away from that, and on your family, some of the the downside of always trying to one up yourself, and thinking anything is possible. You always have to
Yeah.
do more.
Well, I mean, he was a complicated person like everyone else. My father would say, he wasn't perfect, and the parts of him that were bad are as bad as anybody else. The parts of him that were terrific were terrific. But the crux of it is, to do what he did, he really was one of the strongest people to ever live. And think about what that puts your mind into a state of believing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned in the film too, he spent his entire life getting every object he ever touched to bend to his will. He stopped a plane from taking off with his hair. That's nuts. That's not something a sane person does. Because believe me, you don't walk out of this life without having some scars. One of the things he would do, he had 17 different numbers he would do on a regular basis, and he had sort of special ones. But one of the things he used to do was take a nail, and he would put it in a hanky so it wouldn't, hurt his hand, and he would drive it through 19 sheets of metal and a 2-inch board. So with his hand, he would smack it and go all the way through. Well, one time he put the nail backwards, and he's driving down with all of his force, and it went right through his hand. Horrible. So he used to get into the habit of taking the nail and putting it in his mouth first so he could feel the edge of the nail to make sure he had the right side, and he would put it in the. So you have your scars. So in order to have a life where you're still willing to do that, you have to be an egomaniac.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. But that doesn't mean you're a bad human being. He was wonderful, and he would help people, but he was an egomaniac. Make no mistake about it. And that trickles into your personal life too. So, if 80% of him was wonderful and 20% was nuts, believe me, that 20% is a strong 20%. Something else with him, which is, not to be messed with, he was also a jiu-jitsu master, or one of those types of martial arts. And so he grew a long beard in the second half of his life. He didn't have that in the beginning of his life. And he did that because at the time he was performing, being a Jew was not really a thing that people were able just to put out there in public. He was really shunned a lot of places. And he had seen 2 rabbis take a horrible beating and almost die. And he said, you know what? I want to look like a rabbi, so someone messes with me. And he would go around looking for trouble. And you just did not. I hear story after story about him putting people in the grave. It was brutal. And he didn't start fights, but if someone came at him, he would finish them. And when the strongest man in the world hits you, it's a one-punch thing. You're not getting up. And so now you have a strong man who knows he can hurt you, and that's in him all the time. And so if you're looking for a downside, that's probably it, that he knows he's that powerful, and you carry that around with you all the time.
Yeah, sure. And we're talking. This is a very hard time, in history for Jews, and I think something that I found interesting was which history gets written by the winners, so it didn't seem like it was that receptive that Jews were moving to America back then, even before
Right.
everything started. There was a lot of discrimination, and you talked about that, which it seems like how I grew up, even being in a Jewish family, it's taught is, oh, we all fled and everything was great in America. That's not necessarily the case.
Sure. I mean, there's a very famous story we also, talk about in the movie where there was a German quarter of Manhattan. My grandfather had a couple of stores, I guess back when a regular person could have a store on 42nd on Broadway.
No kidding.
And he would lecture. He would do health lecturing. and he was walking through the German Quarter of Manhattan, and there was a giant banner there was a building engraved across, and it said Bund meeting, no dogs or Jews allowed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he, like I said, if there was something that he felt injustice, he was going to go looking for trouble. So he went down the street, he bought a ladder at a hardware store, and he bought a bat, and it was on the second floor, and he put the ladder up to the wall, and he smashes in the window and takes the sign and rips it down, and then goes down the ladder and waits for everyone to come down. From my count, I think it was over 20 people, because it was in the paper, and he had the bat and his jiu-jitsu, and he just beat the bejesus out of all these people. They take him to court, and the officer, the judge, just couldn't believe that was real, that this little tiny guy beat up all those people. When he explained what happened, they let him go. And, my grandfather used to train the police. He actually was quite involved with a lot of police organizations across the country, and he would help train them in self-defense and strength. So, of course, they believed him. And, that's one of those stories that people don't realize how hard Jews had it, especially in New York. It wasn't okay just to be Jewish. And he used to wear a Jewish star on his singlet. He had that classic strongman outfit, Yeah, that was part of his shtick, to make it interesting. And he had that. He wore it very proudly. And I hear stories, hundreds of him being on stage. The heckling would start, and he would let it go for a while, but then sometimes it would get rowdy, and him jumping off stage and knocking people out.
Yeah, what better way? I totally see where he's coming from to prove it when you're pretty much being touted as an inferior race, and you're like, I can do things none of you can do. So
yeah,
whoa.
He had massive hands. His hands were particularly large, part just from having big hands, and part because he would train. One thing that people don't realize about any strongman is the grip strength angle. If you want to be strong at whatever you're doing, training your grip is essential, and training your wrists and forearms to be strong.
Yeah.
There's nothing that you do that you can't gain from that. So his hands, most of us between our pointer finger and our thumb have kind of a soft, a little area that you can just kind of bend. My grandfather could flex that like a muscle. I remember that as a kid. He died when I was 5, and I have very few memories of him, but I remember felt disgusting that he could flex a muscle in between his thumb and his forefinger, and that's the kind of grip strength you have to have. So his hands were massive, and that really did help him over the course of all of his life doing these feats of strength.
Yeah, I think I remember the first time I ever went to a World's Strongest Man competition, or like meeting some of the guys. They weren't 5'4", but I have small hands, and my grip strength's always been an Achilles heel in my career. But of course you were 5, but I remember as a grown man shaking some of these guys' hands, and you get that, like, it almost feels weird. You're like, you get like an immediate feeling of like inadequacy in a way, just because like you're like, oh, like you shook it like you're shaking like a toddler. Like they just grabbed my whole hands, like grabbing like a kid's like 2 fingers. It's it's insane. Yeah, it's like a different feeling. You could just feel like how powerful someone is. Just some of the greats like Phil Pfister, Mark Felix, some of these guys in strongman, or Mike Burke. That was probably the worst. He was he has the world record in the double overhand Apollon's axle. He did like 530 pounds, with the thick bar. It's just something else.
Sure. It's like dunking a basketball. If you can't get your hand around the ball, you can't get it in the rim. Same thing. The larger and stronger your hand, the better you can grip something and do whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah. So, like you look into it, what was some of the actual like, it's different than I think today, but some of the training that your grandfather and your father and uncles did, do you have any recollection of that? Like how it was?
Sure. It wasn't traditional strongman training. It was very much the type of thing they were performing they would do. So like sort of the standard iron bender measure of performance is what's called a 60 penny spike. It's a big fat nail. Mm-hmm. If your average nail is a 20 penny, basically make it about 3 times as thick, and that's how it is. So they would practice bending nails. That was a big deal. And so just over and over, I have some in my house, as a matter of fact, because I started doing it because of the film. I wanted to see if I could do it, and it's been fun. But you just basically just keep doing it over and over, and it's not even so much the muscles as it is the joints that suffer, and you have to really get them up to a place where they can resist, because your wrist and your elbows start, you think you're going to snap. At a certain point, you have to get past the point where your body says stop in any of these things. I imagine it's with weightlifting the same.
Sure.
And so they would do the exact feats of strength that they were going to perform over and over again. So smashing bricks, that was one. Pulling cars. My father tells a story of really when he stopped performing. I think the last time he pulled, it was a fire engine, a fire truck with his hair. So all the boys were on Canal Street in Manhattan. This is probably 50 something. And they all had to pull fire trucks with their hair. My father had never done it. He had pulled cars with his hair, but never a fire truck. And so he would practice, but his brothers told him there's going to be a point where you're going to feel like your head's going to separate from your, from your scalp. And that's the point where you have to double down and pull harder. Like when you feel a pop, which, just think about the implications of that, is nuts. But that's when you have to pull harder. And my father did, and the truck moved and everything was fine, but he almost died. His head blew up for the next couple of weeks, and he was hospitalized because his scalp, everything, I wouldn't call it edema, but it's probably close to that. But they would practice doing things like that for their performances, not really conventional weightlifting, although there was definitely some of that, but not as much as they would practice the actual feats of strength themselves.
Sure. And he's at he's been doing it for decades at this point. So it's kind of just practicing. Once you've acquired a skill, you're just kind of keeping it fresh. I imagine.
Yep.
It's different than, I imagine when, he was younger and just kind of learning this, there's maybe a little bit more, calisthenics, or like you said, he's, filling up things with cement and just picking them up and doing whatever he could just to get that base.
Yeah. And of course there's some just straight up weightlifting, but like we said before, there weren't really weights back then. That wasn't a thing that was available. And it's, you have much more team minded science and energy around training today than ever before. But even, back in 1950, there wasn't very much, let alone 1915.
Sure. Yeah. Even just in like the, past 5 years from, when I was, trying to compete for world championships and all that to now, the strides people have taken, just because it's just, like I competed in the first year we had one for my weight class, and now we're going on, 6-7 years later. So it's, people know it's a thing, and more good athletes. It's just the strides things takes. It's just insane.
Yeah.
But man, it's been great talking to you. The film, it's The Mighty Atom. It's available on Vimeo on demand.
Yeah, it's on Vimeo now, and on November 14th, it is on iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. And currently, you can order it as a pre-order on iTunes.
That's awesome. And there's a website for it, which I believe is the mightyatomdoc.com, and you got some.
That's right.
Some shirts, some mugs up there. Some
we
couple
have,
previews.
We have some clips from the film. We have some pictures of him doing these things. I mean, I'm met with skepticism all the time when I mention who he is. And a lot of people have seen the picture or the old video of the cannonball in the stomach guy, and they've seen some old pictures of my grandfather. They're kind of the two old-time feats of strength. So I have some of those photos up there of him doing incredible things. And, and hopefully people enjoy it and can inspire themselves.
Well, this was fun. This was fun. Just, this was a fun talk. I really appreciate your time and, sharing the film, going through, the labor of love, I'm sure it was, to put this all together so all of us could, kind of get a glimpse into the man your grandfather was. It's really appreciated. And I think, to the people listening, it's important to kind of go back and see where, like, what you're doing today, the kind of the people that paved the way, and look back. And I think you can learn some stuff from it for, to apply your own training, especially in the mindset department.
I hope so.
And we'll put links in the show notes to, buy and pre-order the film. Again, themightyatomdoc.com, and pre-order on iTunes, and it'll be available everywhere on November 14th, and we'll include links to, for each one of those where you can go buy it. And I appreciate everyone listening. This is the Strong Talk Podcast. I'm Kalle Beck, and we'll talk to you all next week.